Okay. So welcome. We are really excited to share what's new with our CoStar Future partnership, the Cosmos modeling, and various other web tools. So just a quick couple of logistics and a reminder. The webinar is being recorded and we will post it online after the meeting. You all as participants are in listen only mode, so you can relax. Everybody's muted. There's no video to worry about. If you have questions, we would love it as they come up throughout our presentations. You can type them into the Q&A, which should show up down at the bottom of your screen. So go ahead and type those questions in as they come up for you. We'll have several opportunities to pause and take questions. There is also a raise hand function that you should also see down at the bottom of your screen. And we'll have some, again, pause points to take some verbal questions as well. If you have any technology issues, please, you can send an email to Lishka Arata at Point Blue. She's helping us with the tech side of things today. So I'm Maya Hayden. I lead our coastal adaptation program at Point Blue Conservation Science. And I'm gonna be the sort of master of ceremonies today and take you through what's new with the coastal storm modeling system from USGS. And then we'll talk about, in particular, the new groundwater hazard modeling and data that is available, and show you how those have been incorporated into both our CoStar Future viewer. We've launched a new website and new viewer in the last week, as well as the USGS Hazard Exposure Reporting and Analytics tool, which takes the exposure hazard information and translates that into socioeconomic impacts. So today I am joined by Patrick Barnard, who's the research director for the Climate Impacts and Coastal Processes team at USGS at their Pacific Coast and Marine Science Center. And he oversees the development and application of Cosmos. Kevin Beefus joins us from the University of Arkansas. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Geosciences and was the lead developer of the California statewide groundwater modeling that we'll be sharing today. Jean Jones is a geographer at the USGS Western Geographic Science Center and was the lead tool developer for the HERA web tool. Dan Hoover is also joining us. He's an oceanographer from the USGS, also at the Pacific Coastal and Marine Science Center. And he has primarily been involved in field data collection and Cosmos support, and most recently been working with Kevin on the QA/QC of the groundwater modeling. We're also joined behind the scenes by Lishka Arata. She's our senior communications coordinator at Point Blue, and she's helping to support and host on the technology side of the webinar today. So that's who you'll maybe see or hear from. And that was us, and this is who's on the other side. So this is who's in our audience today. It's unsurprisingly a real mix of state and local government agencies, staff from NGOs and private consulting, and also a real mix of people with previous experience with our CoStar Future viewer. So we have some new users. Welcome to those. We're excited to show you kind of the overview of what's going on. And then we also have some more regular users as well. So it's about half and half, and we'll try to kind of thread that needle of providing enough background, but also really highlighting what's new for those of you more familiar with it. So our CoStar Future, we're now, I think, in about a decade of this partnership led by Point Blue and USGS. And really the goal was to provide resources to understand, visualize, and adapt to sea level rise and coastal storms. And it was collaboratively developed with stakeholders like you, and continues to be So we really appreciated all of the feedback we've gotten over the years. It's been super helpful in bringing kind of the new viewer to life. And it's the primary platform for visualizing the data from the USGS coastal storm modeling system. And so we're going to kind of run through and highlight what's new, in terms of models and data, functions and features, and also on the communication side, both for the OCOF tool as well as the HERA tool. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Patrick, who is going to give us an overview of what is new in the coastal storm modeling system. So let me get those slides up. And Patrick, if you want to get yourself on screen here, take it away.
Great, thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
I can't get my video turned on, I think, because oh, there it goes. You've allowed me now. Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for joining, everybody. We've been at this for about over a decade now, and many of you contribute in so many different ways to help us kind of move the science in a direction that can directly support your needs. And so this is an ongoing process, and really just thankful for all the feedback over the years, and keep it coming, because the more we hear from you, the more we can improve the product line and support your needs on the ground. So I'm just going to go over briefly the development of Cosmos, talk about a few of the new bells and whistles that we've added, and then turn it over to Kevin to talk about a very exciting development that we've been working on together for about 3 years now. So number of authors listed here, but really it's about 24 at USGS and Point Blue that have been involved in this on the science side, and many, many others. Collaborations really across the world to bring the best science to bear here for California. So go next slide, please. And just again to frame the problem, the climate impacts issue, as Dan and I have been dodging smoke across California and Oregon just to go on vacation. It's a bigger issue than just the coast, but here we're focused on the coast itself. And you can click through these, Maya. So we've got 1 billion people soon to live in the coastal zone across the world. And in some of the work we've done, we've found is that sea level rise is going to cause the once in a lifetime coastal flooding event to occur annually by the middle of the century and every day by 2100. So these impacts are just going to accelerate exponentially as we move forward and sea level rise accelerate. But we also know when we look at the dynamic response of the coast and dynamic water levels, when we consider these factors, about 3 times more people are at risk of sea level rise and storm-induced flooding than from sea level rise alone when we consider that dynamic response of the coast. And so it's really critical to add that piece, and that's what that niche we've tried to fill with Cosmos across California and beyond. And in doing so and working with Jean and the HERA team, what we've found is that now applying Cosmos across most of the urbanized, all the urbanized part of the state, with the exception of the far north coast now, over 500,000 people and $200 billion in property are at risk by the end of the century. So that's about 6% of GDP. So it's a really big number. And just to put in perspective, this is about 10 times greater than the worst wildfires and earthquakes in California history. So something that we need to think about as we move forward, but none of these are predetermined or preordained, so to speak. This is if we do nothing. And so we're trying to provide products that can support coastal adaptation options so we don't see these kinds of numbers in the future. You can click through the next slide, please. So we try to add this dynamic component. When we began this work about 10 years ago, there's primarily bathtub models that were just looking at sea level rise and tides and coastal flooding in that sense. But these are really nice first order screening tools. The NOAA Sea Level Rise Viewer is a great example where it's really nice for looking at the daily impacts of sea level rise. And then we've tried to add this storm induced component and the dynamic coastal response component. And so you can click through a couple, I think, here. And so there's all these other aspects of flooding besides just the bathtub. And an example from Foster City here is, it's vulnerable but not directly impacted by flooding with just 25 centimeters of sea level rise, but you add a storm on top of that, and all of Foster City, for the most part, is at risk. And so this is what we tried to do, is fill this niche, add the seasonal effects of water levels, storm surge, river discharge, wave-driven setup and run-up, and then also consider vertical land motion. So bring in all the physics, look at the future storm patterns using global climate models, and a full range of sea level rise and storm scenarios to hopefully fit any planning horizon. Next slide, please. So we've been doing this now for about a decade. This work has been in development, mostly for California, to bring this physics-based approach to bear on the problem. We've been looking at the full range of sea level rise and storm possibilities. So as extreme as 5 meters of sea level rise in the 100-year storm event, and developing these tools and products in collaboration with many of you across federal, state, city governments, NGOs to meet your needs. And so initially this work was developed for California specifically, but now we've branched out and there's derivations of Cosmos currently being applied in the Pacific Islands, Alaska, Pacific Northwest, the Southeast United States, and we have plans to do this in the Gulf Coast as well. So California has in some ways been the test bed for this. And we've learned so much from all the interactions we've had with many of you to make the science better and make the products better. And now it's being applied at the national scale. Next slide, please. So this is an overview of how the system works. We take the latest wind and pressure fields from global climate models, and we develop global wave models, which are then downscaled to regional and local levels, where we bring in locally and regionally generated seas and surge. We bring the tides in, and then at the extreme local level, we have higher resolution models that transform the waves and water levels across the inner shelf and the surf zone, incorporate fluvial discharge, and then model the overland flow, which is a little bit more advanced now for the North Coast work we're about to complete using some very fast overland flow models, one that's known as Sphinx, so we can actually fully leverage the underlying DEMs at 1 meter resolution for the flood modeling itself. In the background, we make predictions of long-term cliff retreat and shoreline change as well, and that's integrated into the DEM. And then the flooding scenarios are applied on top of that evolved DEM. And once we have the flood maps, the coastal change maps, this is then all moved over to Maya's team at Point Blue for the OCOF viewer, and then to Jean's team for the HERA viewer to translate these hazard zones into socioeconomic impacts. And go through the next slide. And so all these different physics then get pulled into these different scenarios. So from just background daily conditions to the 100-year event. And the one thing that is new, the work that was recently completed in the Central Coast from Point Conception up to the Golden Gate in response to new or more recent state guidance on sea level rise, we've added a 2.5 and a 3 meter scenario to kind of match that upper most extreme projections from the most recent state guidance. So that's now an additional scenarios that are included, and we've taken off a few of the 1/4 centimeter scenarios, 1.25 and 1.75, because we really can't resolve, sort of smaller than 1/2 meter for the most part. And so we kind of took a few off and added a few more. So we had a few more scenarios to fill in the range there between 2 meters and 5 meters. The GIS shape files, if you want to go to that level as well. So that's available in a number of formats and soon to also be available in a CCH hazards portal also. And just a little bit more information here on coastal change work. And you can click through a button here. Kevin, thank you. And so, sorry, I'll go back once and it'll run the animation. I'm not sure if it'll work or not. If not, it's okay. But for the shoreline work, it's a data assimilated approach that looks at observations of shoreline change throughout the last 20 years or so. And then it basically auto-tunes the model every 100 meters. So every single transect across the entire state is a model. Each of those models is auto-tuned, all these different free parameters in the model based on observations. And then we make a forward projection based on that auto-tuning, that hindcast, and then a short validation period. And so what's really exciting about this work is while we relied primarily on LiDAR, and in a few locations, some ground-based surveys like at Ocean Beach, where we have a lot of data. Most of the state only has a handful of LiDAR surveys, so it's really hard to tune a model when you have limited data. But now that we're able to leverage satellite data going back to the mid-'80s using Landsat, and so now we have hundreds and hundreds of shorelines that we're using to auto-tune the model in every location across the state and then make a forward projection. So there's a lot more confidence in the model. And we have data now. We had no data before, or maybe 1 or 2 data points. Now we have 200, 300, 400 or more in every single location. So that's what's really exciting on the shoreline change front. And you can click through to the next slide. Just can't get the animation to go. And this is just showing the particular example in Monterey of how the shoreline is projected to move inland through time influenced by storms and primarily sea level rise in the long term. And then we go through the next slide, please. And so on the cliff side, as a model that we began developing in 2015, the basic concept is that as sea level, you can click through a couple here, as sea level rises, the toe of the cliff is impacted by waves more and more. So this increases the rate of cliff retreat as sea level rises. And in fact, for most of the state, we see an increase in cliff retreat by about 50% to 100% due to sea level rise, as the base of that cliff is just impacted much more frequently. You can click through. And for this model, we've looked at it's actually an ensemble of 5 or 6 different models. Each one is run 100 times for every sea level rise scenario. And we do some weighting, and we end up with a median projection and then a 95% confidence interval moving forward. And so what you'll see sometimes in OCOF is either a line, which is the median, or the zone, which represents a 95% confidence interval, which is what you see on the bottom panel. And you see the confidence decreases as we move forward. It's much wider as the uncertainty gets larger. But now we have a means to quantify that. Next slide, please. And this is just an example showing the median retreat of the cliff edge in Capitola, which is one of the more rapidly retreating areas of the state. But this is a really common setting. We've got lots and lots of houses on bluff tops, not just in the Central Coast, but in particular, North Coast has got some examples as well, but Southern California is sort of riddled with these sorts of communities that have potential long-term risk due to cliff retreat. Next slide, please. And then just a primer for Kevin's work. You know, we're doing a lot of this outreach work for the overland flooding. We kept getting questions about groundwater and agencies talking about impacts that they're currently experiencing. So we wanted to develop an approach to look at how the water table is going to respond to sea level rise. So not just the overland flooding, but also the flooding from below. And we know that the water table will rise at some rate with sea level rise, but in most cases it's a nonlinear rate. And so we were able to get Kevin on board to lead this work to do some physics-based modeling for understanding how the water table will respond to sea level rise and those potential hazards. And so on the left bottom panel, just an example of overland flooding in Pacifica due to an extreme storm at about 2100. But then on the right-hand side, just looking at everyday groundwater hazards, as you click through, you can see that the warmer colors represent shallower, and then the red is emergence. And so even without a storm, there's a potential impact of very shallow groundwater and emerging groundwater that can be a much bigger effect on this community than perhaps the very episodic overland flooding that might not happen till the end of the century. And so this is the work that Kevin's going to discuss in more detail, and it's a really exciting addition to this kind of suite of science and research products that we've been working on. Next slide, please. And so a lot of questions we get is, well, you know, how's this work been used across the state? You know, who can I talk to figure out what they've been up to? And there's a lot of folks on here who could be good contacts. Like Jack Leapster at Marin, for example, we're working with for about a decade, and Carrie Bath and others at the Coastal Commission, Joe Street, for example, and how the Coastal Commission has been using this work. And so those are great folks you can also touch base with outside of us to understand how they've been using this in their planning process. And so just a quick summary. So over several dozen cities and counties have completed their SLR assessments and adaptation plans for updating local coastal programs. Caltrans has used Cosmos quite extensively to assess the vulnerability of their transportation infrastructure in many areas across the state. The Coastal Commission uses these results to evaluate hazards on a daily basis for coastal construction permits. Their work has been integrated into state climate change guidance It's been used to evaluate siting of power plant by the California Energy Commission. It's been used by various ports, including San Diego, to evaluate infrastructure and resource risk. And most recently, the results of Cosmos as translated through HERA have been used by the California State Legislature to justify the $3.7 billion investment in climate adaptation. That was the spending package that was recently agreed to in July. So next slide, please. So this is kind of what we've been up to in the future work now. We're just wrapping up Cosmos for the state. Humboldt Bay flooding hazards is our primary focus right now, and this work's going to come out early in 2022. And then the final piece of the state coverage will be later in 2022, which is the North Coast, which includes redoing, updating work from the Golden Gate up to Point Arena, and then newly released results that have not been done before north of Point Arena up to the Oregon border. We now have fully integrated satellite imagery into the shoreline change model projections for the entire state. And so those results will be out, I believe, later this year. We've also been using Cosmos in collaboration with NOAA to develop an operational flood model in San Francisco Bay. This is going to be going live in 2022. We're doing a lot of pilot work on climate adaptation modeling. That is looking at sort of green and gray infrastructure and adaptation options and how that influences coastal flood risk. This is being led by a PhD student at UCSC, Ray Taylor Burns. And then Kevin and Michelle Hummel have been doing some pilot work to dynamically couple oceanographic forcing and groundwater response. So basically linking Cosmos with ModFlow to better understand sort of shorter term response of the groundwater table to episodic forcing. And so lots of other places to get more information, email me, anyone on my team, Cosmos website, and then you're going to hear more and more about what's new and cool about our coast, our future, and HERA. So thanks so much for your time, and thanks, Kevin, for rescue.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for backing me up there. So I think we have time for maybe one or two clarifying questions for Patrick. I did see one pop up in the Q&A asking what HERA was, and that's the USGS web tools called the Hazard Exposure Reporting and Analytics tool, and we'll be demoing that later. Any other questions?
I do see one other one in there, Maya, from earlier.
Okay, thanks. I don't have that one up because I think that was during my reboot.
Yeah, do you want me to read it out for you?
Yes, please, yeah.
This is from Jack Liebster, 600,000 people and $200 billion. His question is this people who actually are touched by water or the larger system of impacted communities and economies?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jack. That's just exposure. That's just the amount of people and property exposed to the flood projections. However, you know, we've discussed this a lot about cascading impacts, and so there's a question about, well, what are the actual damages to those particular places that are directly exposed? But then there's also the issue of these cascading impacts and teleconnections that, you know, Juliet, Finzi, Hart, and others have worked quite a bit on. And so we think the impacts could potentially be much, much larger, maybe several fold, just because this is just exposure. It doesn't account for you know, disrupting transportation corridors and the transport of goods and services and things like that. So we don't have a good assessment of what that number is, but that's part of ongoing research to truly understand sort of the full breadth of what these impacts are, as opposed to just simple, you know, kind of what's in the flood zone, which is what we're doing right now.
Thanks. And we had two questions asking more about the operational flood modeling for San Francisco Bay and what that will entail. Sure.
That's part of a DWR funded project in coordination with NOAA. And basically what we're doing is in real time linking to the NOAA weather models and water models, the national water model. So this includes the installation, development of a number of high resolution X-band radar stations across the Bay Area to get high intensity precip, which is then integrated into the overland flood models, which is basically NOAA's national flood model, river model. And then Cosmos is linked to that rivershed flooding, so incorporates then the oceanographic piece. And so that's been developed in collaboration with a number of the management agencies across the Bay Area and also the state, for that matter, flood management agencies like Sonoma County, for example. And so that's going to go live to make predictions from 24 to 72 hours in early 2022. And that'll be available in some kind of public facing interface, which we're still working on.
Great, thank you, Patrick. Okay, so we still have some other questions. One thing I will note, so we got several questions about GIS data and access, and we'll provide all of those links as a follow-up to the webinar today. So yeah, don't worry about getting those down. We'll be sure to provide them, and they're also going to be on the website. So.
And I can answer some of these other questions in the chat box while you guys are proceeding.
Great. Can you guys see my screen now? Is that showing up?
Yes.
Looks good.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to do a demo of hopefully my internet maintains, of the new ArccoStar Future platform, and just wanted to acknowledge the folks, especially on our engineering team, Doug Moody, Brad Sichelski, and Martine Magana, who make the magic behind the scenes here happen. So hopefully this will work. So here's our new landing page and the new website with, kind of updated and refreshed look, as well as a lot of new content. And the major features that we have are, there's about information, so the sort of geography, the history, the partnerships, information on how to get started, and we'll hopefully be adding some new things here with tutorials and other things in the next few weeks. Information on how to cite, and then what's really, I definitely am hoping we'll start to get some feedback, so please feel free to send us feedback about the new viewer and the tool. The other thing is we have a case studies page. So this is, as Patrick mentioned, these are just use cases, examples of who and where the Cosmos data and the ArccoStar Future Viewer have been used to support vulnerability assessments, land use planning, other kinds of adaptation planning. So you can basically click through here and see what folks at, for instance, the city of Santa Monica have been up to, and links there. And we are constantly trying to update those, so please keep us informed. And then lastly, we have the science and modeling section, which is really then, what are the latest and greatest projections for the state of California in terms of sea level rise? What's the latest planning guidance? So how have those projections been translated into planning guidance? And then more kind of technical details about the coastal storm modeling system. So links to information. There's a lot of new infographics that we've included that explain all of the elements that are included in the Cosmos flood models. The other piece that's helpful is we've got our FAQs up for both the older San Francisco Bay data, as well as the outer coast, the newer modeling that started down in Southern California and is similar for the Central Coast expansion. The kind of key references for a lot of the more technical work, including the cliff retreat models, the shoreline change, and the more recent groundwater data. And then just the information about the main products that are available through Cosmos and ArccoStar Future in terms of erosion hazards, the shoreline change and cliff retreat data, the suite of flooding related products, and then the new groundwater data. So The main function of the tool is, of course, the hazard map, the new viewer, which has been updated, streamlined, and you always start out with the disclaimer page. And as with old OCOF, all of the main kind of tools and controls are on the left-hand panel here. The legend for what you're viewing is on the right-hand side, and it will default to the California coast region, which are all of the default products from Cosmos. And then here you can pick which topic or which output product you would like to visualize. So again, it defaults to flooding. And then the main controls are similar. So there's the sea level rise scenarios mixed with the storm frequency scenarios. And so you can toggle those on. And so maybe I'll go down and just show a site down in San Diego. And I'm gonna just turn off the map labels just to make it a little easier to see. But this is one of the beaches down in La Jolla, and there's a parking lot here. I spent a lot of time here in my youth, and so it is near and dear to my heart. And so you want to see, well, maybe at 100 centimeters of sea level rise, you maybe start to see the flooding projected here. And if you're new to the modeling, you can click on the information, the little question mark icon, and we have these really great infographics that we worked with the graphic designer to develop, which really explain the kind of details of what it is that you're seeing in terms of flood extent and maximum wave run up, and what do all of these different things mean, both kind of in a picture of the cross section of the shoreline, but then also an example of the output down below. Okay, so those are the main pieces. And then of course we've got all of the products, so you can look at flood duration. And again, clicking on that icon will show you, okay, what is this that I'm looking at, and how does it output into the viewer? And as well as all of the other flood related output products. And then maybe I'll just show the shoreline position. And this one has a couple of different management options. You've got beach nourishment that will take into account historical rates of beach nourishment, as well as this hold the line scenario, and you can toggle that on and off. And again, all of that is explained in the infographics so that you understand what it is that you're looking at here. The other piece is that we do have some functions up here, these tools. So the first one is create a report. So say I want to know, okay, what are the potential thresholds of flooding for this particular parking lot? So it only is currently only available for the flooding topic. But if I click on that, I can draw a freehand polygon, or I can import a GIS polygon, and I can draw around this parking lot, and it will generate this report that basically gives you a summary of all of the sea level rise and storm scenarios combined, what % of that polygon is flooded under those given scenarios. So at the bottom, there's the picture of your of the map that and the polygon that you selected. And then up here, then I can start to see, well, around 125 centimeters of sea level rise, I'm going to have more than 50% of that parking lot flooded permanently. But I may start to get that level of flooding temporarily at only 75 centimeters of sea level rise with a 20-year storm. So you can really start to look at the potential thresholds that might trigger certain adaptation actions for your particular asset. Okay, I am going to pause there and see if we can take maybe one or two quick questions.
Maya, one that came up was highlighting the option to change units. If you want to
Yes.
show that really quickly.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, so most people will quickly discover this where you can use feet instead of meters, and it just changes all of these things. And you'll notice that the legends are all now duplicative, right? So we have metric as well as English units provided. So yes, that is often the first thing that people will do. Change it to feet. Thank you, Kevin. Anything else out there before I hand it back?
It looks like we can probably address those just with kind of non-live answers.
Sounds good. Okay, so next I'm going to turn it over to Kevin, who's going to highlight more details about the groundwater modeling. And Kevin, do you want to control your own slides, or should I just keep doing this?
You can control them for me.
Okay.
Not too many animations.
Okay. I think the animations should work on mine. All right,
Okay,
I'm gonna
yeah,
go
I
off
did
here.
it from Google Slides, so it's a little trickier. All right, thanks, Maya. So my goal now is to tell you a little bit more about this groundwater feature that's been added to our CoStar Future. And so this has been the product of a research study that was really focused on how groundwater and water tables respond to sea level rise. And so there's a lot of science that goes in behind where these data come from, but I'm going to primarily give you an introduction that will be helpful for using the CoStar Future viewer. All right, would you go ahead and advance, please? And so if we have a cross section of Earth, this is one that follows the same infographics that you'll see on our CoStar Future when you hit those little question marks. And so now we're interested in what's going on land. And so at some point beneath your feet, there is a water table where the voids in the ground become full of water. They become saturated with water. And so that's where the water table is. That's how we define it. And fresh groundwater floats on top of saline groundwater. And so as sea level rises, we expect that zone of saturation to change. And so we expect how deep you'd have to drill a well to hit the water table to maybe become less as sea level rises. And so if we advance to the next picture, you'll see that kind of an animated change in the infographics of how much that water table might move upwards. And so we have two effects. One, the water table becomes shallower, but in places where we maybe have depressions on the land surface, we have the potential for groundwater to actually emerge, to produce new springs and seeps. And if that water can't escape, if there isn't a drainage network for it to escape, then we can actually have flooding caused just by, from beneath your feet, right? So flooding from below is what this potential groundwater hazard can be. And so this is sort of what we're trying to represent in the physics-based models that I'll be showing you here in a second. But first, we need to understand something about what sort of hazards. Why should we care about this other than just the flooding perspective? And so in this next slide, I'll be showing, I guess, so this is the water table depth that we really are trying to understand and that the OCOF viewer actually shows. And so it's a map of how deep, or what that little red arrow is, how deep below our feet would be that water table or the zone of saturation, onset of saturation. And so this creates all sorts of hazards. This is a nice infographic that was made associated with our paper. And so beyond just flooding, beyond wetter conditions in the soil, there are all these other connected responses. And so, of course, flooding is something that we don't want, but if we have more groundwater that is entering our creeks and streams, that means that if we do have some sort of rainfall event, that those channels are already somewhat full of water. And so that flooding could be made worse because there's already too much groundwater in it. The same thing goes with storm sewers. If storm sewers are having groundwater leak into them, they're not going to be as efficient at draining the water off the surface. It also, with sewage systems, it starts to become more and more difficult to have gravity do the work for us. And then there's also a lot of other impacts that we're still trying to understand to shallow foundations, to road bases. As you change the saturation of the soil, you change the strength properties. And so if these features weren't designed to handle water or saturated conditions, then there is some loss of expected lifetime and some fatigue that happens. There's also chemical components that could start changing. You're changing how much oxygen is there. You're also potentially mobilizing contaminants. And so there are all these features that could create different types of hazards, physical and chemical hazards. So we'll go on ahead to the next slide. And so the challenge here was to develop predictions or forecasts of what the water table was doing for, in this case, the whole coast of California. Patrick didn't inform me that they were only doing the southern coast at this time, so I went ahead and developed models for the entire coast of California. And so what you can see on the right here are these little boxes, and these are the individual groundwater flow domains that I used ModFlow, just a numerical solver basically for groundwater flow, to predict the water tables. And you'll see that each one of these little boxes or polygons are a little bit overlapping. And so what I did is I ran models with this overlap to make it so that I could create a continuous data set from the output. And so merging the data back together to create continuous water tables for the whole coast of California. A couple things just to know about the modeling. One is that I ran them in steady state. And so these are not including changes in time. They're for long-term average position of the water table. And so these are sort of long-term snapshots. If sea level is at 2 meters higher than today, what would be the average long-term water table? So over the course of an entire year, not including seasonal effects, not including tides, not including storms, what that would look like. And so these are sort of long-term forecasts. So we don't have the dynamics yet. That's what we're currently doing in our studies. So you just kind of more detail here, used Python to run these models, right? A lot of models, there are over 4,000 models that had to be run and merged together for the products that you'll see on our CoStar Future. So I want to go ahead and show you some of the outputs just really quickly before you get to zoom around on the CoStar Future tool. So here's just an aerial imagery of northern San Mateo County. San Francisco Airport is right there in the middle of this view. And then if we click again, you'll see the map of water table depths. And so these colors represent how deep you'd have to drill to hit that saturated zone. And so in red, that's where the water table is at the land surface. And so that's the water table right at the land surface. There's probably active water coming out of it at high tide. And so this is a mean high or high water scenario. Again, I don't have the dynamics in this. And so I had to say where that ocean level was for these long-term models. And so this is a pretty high tide. And then if we go and click through the next few slides, I'm going to be raising that with sea level rise. You'll see that up in the top on the red bar that the mean high or high water plus 1 meter of sea level rise. You can see that there's a lot of inundation. But what's interesting is that you don't see the colors changing too much for how deep the water table is. And so this is one of the exciting things that we wrote the paper about, is that the land surface, the topography really controls how much this water table can move with sea level rise. And so if you already have a valley, the groundwater might be connected to the creek there. And so even if you raise sea level, you're not going to be able to raise the water table very much because it's already at the land surface. It's already discharging actively, providing base flow to that creek. So yeah, we can go ahead into the next example. So that was sort of a static one. This is one where it's looping through increasing sea levels. This is just north of there. So we have Stinson Beach, if you're familiar with that. And so here you can see a nice peninsula that's already has pretty shallow groundwater today. And then you'll see that that gets flooded out. It looks like the animation isn't looping, but that's okay. But here there's also that creek to the west, and you can see that there are some changes, that there is a shallowing or emergence of the water table in that area. All right, so this is the map view. This is the sort of data that you'll be looking at, not animated, in the CoStar Future app. But I also wanted to give you a cross-section view of what this is like. And so would you go ahead and click one more time? I think some arrows will show up. Yep, so these are where we're going to actually look at the cross-section. What does the water table look like if we could cut away half of the earth and look at it from the side? So let's go ahead and go to that slide. And so now at the 1, 2, 3, those are the 3 panels here. And the different colors of the water table are for different geologies. And so this is one of the limitations, is that For modeling how the water table looks in the subsurface, we actually have to know how easy it is for water to flow through the geology that's there. And so not only do we have to know the 3D geology, so the rocks and where they are in space, but also how easy it is for water to flow through it. And those are actually both really hard things to do. And so to get a sense of that uncertainty and to put limits on that uncertainty, we ran 3 different geologies. And so in green is the geology that makes the water back up. And so it piles up because it's not easy for that water to flow through the ground. And so it backs up, it piles up. And so you get a much steeper water table that ends up being a lot closer to the land surface. And so if we care about groundwater flooding, this green or low permeability case is the one that's going to have the most hazard, the most flooding hazard. In the blue is sort of the middle range one that actually does compares really, really well with all the well observations that we had for California. And so that's the default that our CoStar Future will show you. And then in red is one that is more like a gravel and relatively high permeability that lets water flow really easily. And so that's why it's flatter. But that's also going to respond to sea level more. You'll see that that one goes up as the sea level rises more and more in this animation. All right, let's go ahead and zip on through. So one thing about these physics-based models is that they are trying to represent the topography and how much water is flowing out of them. A simpler way would be if we knew the water table today, couldn't we just raise that by the same amount as sea level rise? And so here in that blue curve at the bottom that has water table present on it, the dashed line, if we raise that by sea level, we get the dark blue water table. And then usually we know that the water table isn't probably going to be floating above the land surface. And so we say, well, the maximum height of that should be the land surface. If we do that, that's sort of a worst case scenario. It does give us a really conservative, careful prediction of what the water table would look like, but it's going to generally over predict how much that water table does move up with sea level rise. And so that's there in gray. There's a 2-headed arrow showing the difference between that pink curve, which is the physics-based water table, and then the dark blue line. And so we can actually calculate that based on the models by taking these 2 different approaches, saying, well, we know the water table today based on the model predictions. We can raise it by the same amount of sea level rise, and then we can compare that just raised by sea level versus the full modeled prediction to get a sense of what areas respond exactly the same as sea level rise. And so the water table goes up same as sea level rise, or that they don't, and they're more or less pinned. And so on this next slide, I'm showing you a map of what that looks like for San Francisco Bay for 1 meter sea level rise for one assumption of geology. And so in red here are places where if we've raised sea level by 1 meter, the areas in red, the water table does not change at all. And so we're 100% over predicting the amount of water table rise if we say that that rises the same amount of sea level rise. As we get into the oranges and then into black, those are parts of the coast that are responding to sea level rise, at least some percent. It's maybe not a full meter of sea level rise, but maybe we have 5 centimeters or 10 centimeters of water table rise associated with 1 whole meter of that sea level rise. So the water table is rising, some percent of that sea level rise. And so it is important to say that, of course, the model is this sort of long-term perspective. And so real water levels in wells in the water table, they go up and down seasonally. They go up and down with the tide. And so, right, a large rainfall event or over the entire winter, if there's more rain than in the summer, then you do expect the water table to go up pretty significantly. And so there are these dynamics that can be added on top of this long-term perspective of the water table. So it's not that these forecasts or these diagnostic models that we're doing here for groundwater tell the whole story. They're telling the long-term story. And so it's still important, if you're going to be zooming in on a particular area, to know what those wells are doing. How do they respond seasonally? How do they respond to the tide? And so there's this opportunity to combine observation data, which in a lot of places it's hard to find several wells, especially wells that have water levels over, maybe every day for a year. And so we're hoping that you can use these outputs to say, well, we need a new well here, and we need to observe what happens with tides and with seasons. And so that's our hope for the combination of this sort of modeling approach informing going out and actually taking observations using the observational data that are there as well. So my last slide is just a bunch of websites that we should put in the chat so that you have them handy. Of course, we're going to be sharing them with you later. And yeah, happy to take questions. Trying to squeeze it all in.
Thanks. Thanks, Kevin.
All right, it looks like we've got a few good questions in the chat here. From Christy Cole, why did you use MHHW as your sea level as opposed to using a higher tide or mean sea level?
So mean higher high water is a pretty high average condition. And so the water table takes a certain amount of time to respond to a tide. And so the dynamics of the water table are actually much more dampened or filtered compared to the actual tidal signal. And so generally groundwater responds pretty slowly to these dynamics, and it also decays very rapidly as you go away from the coast. And so the average water table is somewhere between the mean water level and the mean higher high water based on a few papers. There haven't been many studies on this. And so trying to get this long-term perspective, we had to pick where that baseline was. So you can add a meter or two to these data sets and get a decent sense of what's going on. It would take additional post-processing of the raw data though.
Awesome, thank you. And I think we have time for one more question. This comes from Jackson Bauer. He says, not sure if I understand how all of this works, but should we expect to see any locations of non-progressive water table modeling effects, similar to how some locations have greater surface flooding with a 20-year storm in comparison to a 100-year storm?
So I think it is pretty much a progression of the groundwater flooding gets worse and worse. It's not like it leaps forward. It gets worse and worse until either the marine inundation, so how I treated the oceanographic side of things, either that floods, there ocean or tidal conditions there. And once that happens, it's ocean and marine pretty much forever in the modeling. Yeah, you don't really get a back and forth. Since we're not changing the geology, we're not changing the climate. As we continue to raise sea level, you don't have the opportunity really to backtrack at all in terms of the groundwater hazard. And so I would say that it's more of a progression, continual progression, definitely not a linear progression.
Thanks, Kevin. It looks like there's a handful more questions, so if you're able to take a look and maybe we can answer those via chat. Back to you, Maya.
Thank you. All right, so I'm going to show how the data that Kevin just talked about has been ingested into the ArccoStar viewer, our future viewer. So again, if we're here on the hazard map, we're going to go to the topic down at the bottom of groundwater. And maybe before I do that, I'm going to just go to 0, 0. So again, what we're seeing is the depth to the groundwater, right? So you have to kind of like shift your thinking where you're used to seeing these polygons, meaning like that these areas are flooded. Now you're actually seeing the depth to the groundwater table surface. So again, those red areas are those that would be emergent at the surface of the land. Orange is the very shallow areas, which you may end up with kind of soggy ground. The yellow is 1 to 2 meters deep, etc. So moving on. And then the other piece here that I'll show is just, again, you can click on this infographic to explain what exactly it is that you're looking at in terms of depth to groundwater, the marine inundation piece, and then the example model output. And then I think, Justin, I saw your question about guidance on which of the permeabilities to use. And so we have provided that again with this infographic that talks about what do each of the options kind of mean? And then, for those of you more technical in terms of hydraulic conductivity values, but then also just some guidance on if you have information about your local geography, you can look to see, geology or groundwater, then you can look to see which one of these might fit best with your local information. But if you don't, the suggestion really is to use the moderate or the more permeable, which tend to have the best overall fit to the groundwater data that Kevin and colleagues looked at across the entire state of California. So it's a good starting point, basically. The other way to think about these is in terms of your risk tolerance, right? So if you have really critical assets that you're concerned about, and therefore lower risk tolerance, you might choose this less permeable option because it's going to give you the shallowest water table, right? So the water table will be closer to the surface under this option. And so that is, potentially going to give you that long-term kind of worst case scenario versus if you are looking at assets that maybe aren't so critical, you could potentially look at some of the more permeable options. Okay, and then again, you can kind of see how with maybe a meter of sea level rise, that expands. And so that's really all, again, available to you here in the viewer with the other information. The other features of the tool that I just wanted to give an example of is that you can now compare scenarios. And this is for any of the topics, but we can look at it for groundwater. And this gives you then two of these toolbars. At the top one controls what you see on the left side of the screen, and the bottom, what you see on the right. And so you can choose different combinations of sea level rise. For groundwater, we don't have the storm scenarios, right? The dynamic components are not included yet. And you can drag the screen back and forth to see the differences between those things. And so maybe as another example, I'll show flooding, and I want to look at 3.3 feet and then nothing. And we can go back to that parking lot, and you can kind of get that view. The other piece that I just wanted to point out is that we now have data download. And so this will give you access to all of the flooding products that you see in the viewer, and they're packaged by county and by product and sea level rise scenario. So you can basically, you just need to register for an account to get access to it and get access to all of those data. Now, what we currently have up for bulk downloads are just the flooding outputs. So we will also be sure to provide you the links to the USGS site where the erosion data, the shoreline change and cliff retreat data are hosted, as well as the groundwater data that Kevin has produced statewide. All right, I think that is all I was going to go into here. Oh, the other thing I just wanted to point out, sorry, one last thing, is that we do have these additional layers. So if you click on this little pancake button, we have additional layers. Look also at FEMA hazard zones. You can overlay buildings, so those will pop up. There's a lot of basic kind of infrastructure assets, as well as natural resource information. Change the opacity of those. And then you can also click here to get more information. Okay, so once again,
Okay, I think so. Thanks for your patience with these technical difficulties. I'm going to step in and take us over to Jean for an intro to the Hazard Exposure Reporting and Analytics web tool. Jean, do you want to come on? Oh, you're just voice today, is that right?
Yes, and you were going to run the slides?
Yes, I've got
Great.
slides, so I'll show those now. All right, can everybody see that?
Yes. Looks good. All right. Thank you, Lishka, and thank you, Maya. I'm Jean Jones with the Western Geographic Science Center. We designed the Hazard Exposure Reporting and Analytics web tool, which we call HERA, to take a look at the impacts to communities by these various hazards. And we really want to characterize community exposure to these hazard zones based on sea level rise scenarios. Or as Patrick says, we want to translate the hazards into policy motivating information that can perhaps get more attention from policymakers than just showing them a flood map. So can you go to the next slide? What is HERA? It's a web tool that provides geospatial data and tools to map and estimate community and county exposure to natural hazards. So community exposure, we're looking at census incorporated cities and census designated places. And also we aggregate up to county levels. What can you do with HERA? You can build maps with hazard scenarios and community assets. You can estimate the hazard exposure of people, economic assets, critical facilities, infrastructure, and land for a specific hazard zone and a specific community. You can learn how it changes for the communities with different scenarios. You can compare community exposures across a region, and you can download results at the community or county level. And we have in our HERA tool both the coastal flooding mapper and the groundwater tool as well to look at changes in groundwater depths relative to the land surface. So can we go to the next slide? This is our starting page, and if you have a second screen and you want to just log into HERA, www.usgs.gov/app/HERA, you can start playing around with the tool. This is a general page for HERA. You can see in the very front and center, you can launch either the coastal flooding or the coastal groundwater tool. We have quick access to user support, how to get started, some guided tours, information on data and methods. We have a contact us button, which believe me, it really works. That is forwarded directly to my email. So go ahead and contact us if you have any questions. We let you know what our updates are when we change anything. And in the upper right, you'll see the buttons home, get started tools, which is the same information, whereas you're seeing down below, and some additional information. Next slide, please. This is the coastal flooding tool. We've designed this to be hopefully as intuitive as possible. You can select the place that you want to look at. We have it listed by counties. If you click on the arrow next to Alameda County or any county, you can see all the individual communities as well. So you can select an entire county, or you can just focus on one community at a time. You can select more than one at a time, and it will provide you with all of that information. The availability, as Patrick said, we have the entire California coast and San Francisco Bay, except for the far north, Del Norte, Humboldt, and Mendocinos. Next, we have choose your flood hazard, your storm scenarios of current conditions, annual 20-year or 100-year flood, and then the sea level rise scenarios of no sea level rise up to 200 centimeters. You can see below that also we have the convert to feet if you're more comfortable working with feet instead of meters. And the flood hazard next is your selection with the most likely minimum or maximum. That's the minimum of all the uncertainty variables or the maximum of all the uncertainty variables. You can select which one you want to see. And finally, choose your asset. You see the 5 blue buttons there that you can open up and see, select, I want to look at total residents. I want to look at only renters. It will break it down, your economy. I want to see parcels. So And whenever you select that, I see we've gone off a little bit off the bottom on my screen, but the dashboard will pop up and it will give you the information for the selection that you have. And at the front, we have the map showing the layer, and you can use the opacity bar in the map legend for the map layers and also for the data when you see it. Next slide. We tried to make the two tools look very similar. So if you're comfortable with one, you'll get used to the second one. This is the coastal groundwater one. Again, at the start, you've got your places. This groundwater is available for the entire coast and bay counties. We have the same sea level rise. The next one we have is groundwater depth. So as Kevin and Maya talked about, you can look at shallower than 5, shallower than 2 meters, shallower than 1, water table at surface, or the marine inundation. And you see that bar above it, which says cumulative. Whenever you've got cumulative on, you're seeing the map on the right, which is showing you all those layers at once. But if you just wanted to focus on, I'm only interested in shallower than 1 meter at this time, click that cumulative, the button slides over to discrete, and the map and the data will only be talking about that one particular layer of the groundwater data. Also, you can convert that to feet as well at the bottom. And the permeability, you can select under groundwater geology, more, moderate, or less permeable. Again, we've got our assets and the dashboard is going to pop up. So let's go to the next slide. We also have a lot of guidance, the same as our CoStar Future. We're really trying to provide the backup for you if you need information. If you click on the information buttons, if you go to those tabs with more information, how to create a flood hazard map, what storm frequency means, how to choose a sea level rise scenario, or what most likely min or max might mean. So let's go to the next slide. What data are we using and how are we estimating this? We are doing GIS base analysis at the census block level of every jurisdiction, every hazard zone scenario, and every asset. We start with community boundaries, incorporated places, unincorporated, census designated places from the Census Bureau. We also look at residents, and we break down not only to total residents, but vulnerable age groups under 5, 65 and older, ethnicity, race, group quarters, institutionalized or non-institutionalized. That's really whether the doors are locked or not. Think prisons for institutionalized and dorms for non. Household types. Right now, we still have the 2010 census information because the Census Bureau has not yet released all of these information for 2020. As soon as they do, we will update all of our data and we will put that in the update window that we've just moved to Census 2020 with the new blocks as well. For economic data, we have a private database from InfoUSA showing employees by sector. We get parcel values, total land improved from all the counties, and we have HAZUS building replacement value. This is not content replacement, just the building replacement and broken down by the type of building. That is 2014. As soon as census moves up, we'll move that up to 2016, I think is HAZUS most recent. Employees is 2020, right before the pandemic. So that is pre-pandemic employees. Land type, we get that from the National Land Cover Database. We're going to update to 2019 as soon as the census goes up. Infrastructure, we're looking at roads, railroads, landfills, water and wastewater treatment plants, and then critical facilities, the fires, hospital, police, medical services, and schools. So we do exposure estimates. We report them at the community and county level, but we are actually running the data at the census block level. And just a note, exposure estimates are not loss estimates, and they're not based on engineering analysis or other local studies. So we hope if you see some numbers that look like it needs more information, that would be a good reason for your community to do an engineering analysis or a local study, but we are not going at that level. Next slide, please. So when you click on an asset, the dashboard pops up And again, we wanted to make them look the same. So if you know one, you're going to know the other. You see at the top of the dashboard, there's 3 tabs: View Place Summary, Compare Places, and View Data Table. On View Place Summary, you've got 3 separate graphics here. The first one is like a fuel gauge. It's showing you the totals and the community percentage of asset exposure. Oh, I'm sorry. And at the top, you see East Palo Alto and the arrows, the carrots going either way. You can click through all the communities in the area that you selected. So if this is East Palo Alto for 100 centimeters of sea level rise and annual storm frequency, most likely flood scenario, you can expect to see 6,500 residents impacted, which is 23% of the total residents within East Palo Alto. And down below, you can see the groundwater. This is a cumulative, so you're seeing all 5 colors and the amount that is impacted. If you selected discrete, you would see only one of those bars on that graph. The middle graph is showing you the bar chart, how that number changes with the different sea level rise assumptions. So with 0 sea level rise, it would be only estimated 703 people in East Palo Alto, up to 11,000 with 200 centimeters of sea level rise. And down below, you can see, oops, that's the city of Alameda. I'm sorry, down below is showing the city of Alameda, not East Palo Alto. You can see how as sea level rises, you see the change in the groundwater layers of marine inundation and the different depths. The final one is showing you for sea level, for flooding at the top. It's showing you how those numbers change with different storms. So the annual storm, 6,500 people affected in East Palo Alto, a 100-year storm, 7,600 people. And down below, we're showing the exposure with different permeability. So for sea level, for that 100 meters of centimeters of sea level rise, you can see the change in the estimates from more permeable, moderate to less permeable. Next slide. The second tab is Compare Places. If you want to be able to see all the communities that you selected and how they compare, the graph on the left is showing the total amounts of asset exposure for many communities. Now, this is number of residents in the hazard zone. You can see how Foster City has a lot more affected residents than East Palo Alto. The next one showing up is Menlo Park. Down below, you can see the groundwater farther south. We're looking, this is Alameda County. The graph on the right, the 2 on the right, are comparing the total percentages for the communities. So while some communities may have fewer people, it may be a larger percentage of the total community. So it's important to look at both of those aspects. And you can sort these in various ways under the sort by bar at the top. Next slide. Finally, we have the view data table. If you just want to get the numbers. This is going to show you the total for everything that you selected and then all the communities. If you select several counties, this is going to be one long list with every county, the communities alphabetized per county as you go across, and the total will be the sum of them all. And you can download this table as a CSV, comma, separated values that you can open up into Excel. So you have the ability here to look at the numbers themselves. You have the ability to download the hazard exposure data by community. You can also just aggregate by county and see the county hazard exposure tables. We have our data dictionary here, which describes each one of our variables that we're working with, and then the metadata for the geospatial format. And final slide. Contact us. Thank you. You can write comments in here, ask questions. We could give you all of our emails, but I'm just going to direct you to this page, and this will show up in my inbox, will show up in Nate Woods, the principal investigator's inbox. We're all going to see these emails when you send it to them. If you have any questions, you want to suggest new things that you want to see, you find any errors, please let us know, or just tell us how you're using the tool. And so HERA, again, is here to be used to see community exposure to those hazards. Thank you, and back to you, Maya.
Thank you. And I am back. Thanks for the backup there, folks, as I continue to have technical issues. So thank you, Jean. There are a couple of questions for you, Jean, and then also if folks have questions about any aspect of what was presented, please feel free to type them in the Q&A. And we will get to them either live right now or after the fact. And be sure to share them with everybody, as well as you can raise your hand. I see a couple of people with raised hands as well. So we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. Jean, there was one question. It wasn't clear. The exposure analysis is available at the census block level?
No, it is not. We aggregate our data so that we don't release that information at the block level, because some of our data is actually proprietary or not available to the public. So we don't release it at the block level. We calculate it, we only release it at the community level.
Great, thank you. And then there was one other one, land improvement value is only improvements that had permits, not unpermitted. Is that correct?
Land improvement has to do with parcels. So if you look at parcel data, they break it up into total parcel values, just the land value, and improved value, which I guess is any structure that's on it. So this doesn't have anything, whatever the county considers improvement. I don't know if that would be permits or not.
Great, okay, thank you. And now I'm going to invite everyone to turn their videos on. I know, Jean, you're keeping yours off because of your internet issues. So Dan, Patrick, and Kevin, can you guys turn them on? Let's see. Awesome. I think we had one question, which is it possible to access Cosmos model outputs as water surface elevation instead of flood depth? For instance, for use as boundary conditions in riverine, estuarine hydraulic models. I can take that, or Patrick, go ahead.
Yeah, we can provide that, sure. I don't know if through OCOP or USGS, you can just contact us. I don't think that's a problem.
Yeah, what is currently in our on the OCOF downloads packaged in the flooding includes water surface elevations. So there's depth to ground, there's the depth, sorry, not depth to groundwater, depth to the ground surface for surface flooding, as well as the water surface elevation layers. So they're provided there.
Yeah, I believe Caltrans requested that some years ago. We made that a priority. So I think, yes, and that's also available on our science-based website as well. So I think we have that covered now.
Yeah. And yes, several folks have used that. Okay. And then I don't know if other questions came up, because when I was on, I got dropped. So Kevin, was there anything else that I've missed?
I was trying to answer most of them just by typing answers. So there are a long series of answered questions in the Q&A.
Sounds good. And then if anyone else, I saw a couple people raise their hands and then come down. Anyone else want to ask a verbal question? Go ahead and raise your hand now. All right, Jack, go ahead.
Okay. Unmuting. Actually, I want to call attention to Todd Hollenbeck's question, which is the same that I had. What are the common resources for a local planner to understand local geology and choose groundwater geology setting in the model?
Thanks, Jack. You want to answer that, Kevin?
Sure, yeah. Would you go ahead and share the infographic that we do try to address this with the little question mark next to the choices of the different permeabilities. And so this is one of the struggles that we had even developing the models, was what is the geology? How does the hydrogeology, what are the parameters that control how water moves and the height of the water table? How do those, how do we actually put those into the models, especially at the super high resolution that the models are performed at? And so there's that question mark there that right there by the groundwater geology. And we do kind of go into what you can see or like which option should I choose. And so if you do have wells where you can look at the observations of water levels, and you can say, okay, well, in this area that we have 3 wells, maybe you only have 3 wells in your whole town. You can look at those water levels relative to what the models are predicting for that area and say, well, okay, well, it looks like even though, I had to run these models for the whole coast of California, I couldn't refine the geology because the 3D geology just wasn't available. And so you can say, okay, well, it looks like it fits best. The model outputs fit best with our 3 wells that we care about in our area, and go with that to pick your geology. The other option is to say you care more about the hazard. Do you want to be extra careful in this groundwater hazard, or are you less concerned about it? And so that also lets you choose which geology to use, because the low permeability, the less permeable option, is going to have the highest water table from these model outputs, and it's going to be the least responsive to sea level rise. The other option is the most permeable, and that's going to have the deepest water tables now, but it's also going to be the most responsive to sea level rise. And so you can look at it both ways. Do you have data that you can, or wells that you can go use and say, okay, well, we know something about the geology of this area. You can also link geology roughly to permeability, even though it's not a perfect connection. Or you can say we care more about the hazard side, and so we're going to use this more as a hazard planning tool. And then, of course, if you have the funding, or you can find the funding to go out and drill a couple wells and monitor it for a year, that's another option where you can say, okay, well, this is a long-term planning tool, and so we can go and ask for money to go ahead and try to refine this for our area. You can, there will be a need for more groundwater models to be run and more wells to be drilled. We don't say that this modeling output is perfect.
Great, thank you. All right, and then we saw one last question. I think this is around the Humboldt Bay and kind of North Coast region, and so apologies if that was unclear. It's the Cosmos modeling, the flooding is basically underway for those North Coast counties. And so Humboldt Bay is going to be, I think, first up, and Patrick mentioned that will be available in the spring of next year, and the whole North Coast will be completed towards the end of next year. That's right, Patrick?
Yeah. That's correct, yep.
Great. Okay, so I think with that, we are going to move just real quick to a couple closing things, and we will let everyone go. So in terms of what's next, really in the next month or two, we're doing these types of demos and gathering feedback from you all. So please, as Jean mentioned, contact us both for OCOF and for the HERA tool, so that we can, see how people are responding to the new tool. Through the end of December, we're going to be making some prioritized adjustments to the viewer as we are able. And then in December, we are officially retiring the old OCOF viewer. So we are going to be hosting both for the next several months, so to help people make that adjustment, especially those of you that use OCOF very frequently in your daily work. You can still access it, but it will be retired at the end of the year. And then next year, as I mentioned, we'll be adding that North Coast data, as well as it sounds like the HERA tool will be updating a lot of its analytics when the new census data comes out, et cetera. So lots of things up and coming. And I just really wanted to thank everybody. Thank you to our panelists for joining us today. and for backing me up as I had internet issues. And then also really to the larger team that makes Cosmos, OCOF, and HERA possible. Thank you to our funders who provided the support to update these platforms. And then especially thanks to all of you for joining us today. Our goal really has always been to co-create these resources with you, because at the end of the day, you all are the ones that have the difficult job of making decisions with your communities on what the future of our coast is going to be. So please do reach out to us. We are here to support you as you make these tough but really critical decisions about the future of the coast with climate change. Thank you, and we will be sure to share all of the links and information, the link to the presentations, the link to the video, etc., as in the next day or two. So we'll send that out to all the participants. Thank you all so much. Appreciate it.